Very glad to see you all here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and jump in because, time is my greatest enemy. Well, second greatest enemy. We'll talk about my greatest enemy tonight. And it's not my wife. We're in Revelation chapter 12. We get a fresh start on a new chapter tonight. We don't have to finish up anything. We just jump right in and go. And we'll see how far we can get. Revelation chapter 12. Now, any of the visions that we see in Revelation are subject to, being interpreted any number of ways, and I'm sure there are crazy notions about the visions that we'll talk about here tonight. But in my view, in the work that I do in studying this chapter, this vision seems to be the most obvious in terms of the symbols that are being described, in terms of what the big picture is that's being revealed in this vision. And the most obvious connections. Now, that's not to say there's not confusion about these. It's not to say that everybody's in agreement about what these are, but the big picture of this chapter is hard to miss. It's a victory. It's a victory for Christ and His people, and it is the undoing of our enemy. It is the beginning of basically the second half of Revelation. If you want to look at the sections of Revelation, there have been 3 to this point. The first 3 chapters, Jesus in the first chapter is seen among 7 lampstands, and those are 7 churches, we're told, symbolically. And he goes on in the next few chapters to issue a letter, an epistle to each of those 7 churches. In chapters 4 through 8, we begin at the scene of the throne of God. The one seated upon the throne has a scroll at his right hand, and there is only one and only one, who is worthy to take that scroll and break the 7 seals. And so the next 7 that we see in the next section is these seals. And then in chapter 8, after the conclusion of the opening of the 7th seal, we begin to see a vision of 7 trumpet blasts, 7 trumpets of warning, trumpets of judgment. And that has concluded in chapter 11. And so we're beginning another section, and the way Hendrickson breaks it out, it continues through chapter 14 and verse 14. And as with all of these visions, these repeated different perspective visions, they all begin with Christ and they all end at the point of His second coming. They overlap each other, they're parallel to each other. And this chapter is no different. Giving an overview of this chapter and the ones that in the chapter or 2 that follows, Hendrickson says, "It is clear, therefore, that the central theme of the first main division," that's up the Bible, the Revelation up to this point, "is continued in the second." That theme is the victory of Christ and of His church over the dragon and his helpers. That's what it's about, victory, the victory of Christ. But whereas the first main division pictures the outward struggle between the church and the world, the second part of the book reveals the deeper background. We now see more clearly than in the preceding division that the conflict between the church and the world is but the outward manifestation of the war between the Christ and Satan the dragon. It is noteworthy that in chapter 12 the dragon is first pictured as purposing to destroy Christ. Failing this, he persecutes the woman because she brought forth the Christ. Unsuccessful in this also, he makes war with the rest of her seed. Lenski's summary. Here there is pictured the effort of Satan against Jesus and then against His church during the New Testament era until the end. This vision stops just before the end and reserves the description of this for other visions. If you were to look to Scripture itself to see an overview of this chapter, you could find a couple of those, one from 1 John, one from Hebrews. 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, "Whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil." That's what this chapter is about. Or Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 and 15. "Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, He Himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death He might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery." You see, Jesus takes the initiative to come and be among us, to live in the flesh as we live in the flesh, and Jesus is on the offensive. He's coming to destroy Satan. That's His purpose. He knows what Satan has done. He knows how Satan has defiled and corrupted and misled and deceived and destroyed. And He's come to destroy the destroyer. And so, looking at the text, Revelation 12, verse 1. We'll read through verse 6. "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to His throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. And we'll pause in our reading right there. And the scene, of course, begins in heaven. It is vision in heaven. And as such, we get a different perspective of what is possible for us to see in this world. In this world, things appear a certain way, and we have to have a revelation from God to know the spiritual realities that we're reading about in this book, in the book that we have from God. God tells us, God reveals to us things we wouldn't know through the lenses of this earth life we experience here. And this vision that John has of this scene that's going to unfold is going to give him a different perspective of what's taking place, the battle behind the scenes. And it begins with this woman. Going back to the text, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. Who does this woman represent? It is God's people. God chooses people and He makes covenants with them. He makes these agreements with mankind. He will be God, they will be His people. And God has been making covenants with men for quite some time, even dating back to before the time of Christ. God had a covenant people, a people that He had chosen, a people that He had made through agreement, promises. He'd made a promise to Abraham. And He kept that promise even though Abraham's descendants found themselves in oppression in Egypt. God delivered them out of that bondage, took them to Mount Sinai, and there established a covenant with them, and they became His people. The people through whom the world would know Him and His power and His ways. And so often they failed in that covenant. And so often they experienced difficulty in carrying out their end of that covenant. They, the nation of Israel, the covenant people of God, are the woman. And in this story, in this vision, it's not a story, it's a vision. In this vision, we'll see this woman become, instead of the people of the covenant at Sinai, they'll become people of the new covenant. And you won't notice. There is no mark in here that says any different. That, oh, there's suddenly a change and this woman's different. There's a continuity that just naturally transcends from one to the other when the child takes his place on the throne. And what I'm meaning by that is the covenant people of God become the church. Once the church is established, we are God's people. We are the people in covenant with God. That covenant was foretold in Jeremiah, established through the blood of Christ. And we today are the woman. Collectively, us, the church, we are that woman. And what we see in this vision is just how glorious this woman is. And that's not a picture you get much of when you look at it from an earthly perspective. The image of a woman is used, this is from Linsky, is used because the birth of the Savior is to be pictured. Jesus uses a woman to represent the church in two of His parables, Luke chapter 15, verse 8, Matthew chapter 13, verse 33. The Old Testament makes the church Yahweh's betrothed and uses the imagery of a woman in many striking and often lovely ways. For example, Psalm 45, verse 13. The image is used to represent the people of God. As God so often in the Old Testament talked about His people and marrying His bride. And in the New Testament times, we see that the church is the bride of Christ. And we'll see the marriage that takes place at the end of Revelation as Christ is, that consummation takes place, that marriage takes place at the end of our time in this world. Ultimately, the coming of Christ is the fulfillment of the prophecy God makes to Eve at the time of the judgment for her sin, Genesis chapter 3. The serpent is the one who introduces, convinces the woman who, it's curious. Well, I'll save that for my Sunday morning class. But she's not named until after this whole thing is settled. By the way, I will put enmity between you and the woman, which is all she's called up to that point. And between your offspring and her offspring, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. This is what's being depicted in the vision. God was foretelling in Genesis chapter 3 just what He was going to do to defeat this one who has come in and corrupted his creation, the one who has introduced sin into creation. He is going to take this woman and her offspring and use that offspring to defeat and ultimately win the victory over the one who has foiled God's plan. But you really can't do that. You know, God's going to win. God knew that was going to happen. Linsky says Roman Catholic interpretation finds Mary in the symbolism. And I've heard people say, well, where do you ever see Mary glorified in any way in the Bible? And this is the one place that I've seen them go to, and I think it's a terrible misreading of this text. To find that, and certainly we understand that Mary is the mother of Jesus. He's conceived in her virginity. She is a great servant of God. I'm not disparaging Mary. But this passage is not glorifying Mary. And to see Mary as the interpretation of this woman is missing the point. And you also have trouble with the end of the chapter when you do that. The glory that we see here, the sun and the moon and the 12 stars, the crown of 12 stars, shows the heavenly perspective of the covenant people of God. From our perspective, how does Paul say? Consider yourselves, as he begins 1 Corinthians, you aren't the smartest people. You aren't the wisest people. We're the ordinary people of the world. There's nothing special or great about us from an earthly perspective. We're not particularly glorified by other people in this world. Matter of fact, it's probably the opposite of that. We're looked down upon, considered weak for being people who rely on this crutch of faith. But from the heavenly perspective, from God's perspective, from the eternal perspective, the church is glorious. It's beautiful, stunningly beautiful, eminently glorious. And she's crowned with these 12 stars that comprise a crown, a Stephanos. And you'll see this in Revelation. You'll see it in the rest of the New Testament at different times. This term that we translate crown, it's the crown of victory. It's what you award someone who conquers, someone who wins. A Roman leader who would go out and conquer, gain a victory for his nation. Maybe an athlete gaining a victory. Speaking of this glory, Linsky says John sees the church in her real glory, for which reason also she is seen here in heaven and not on earth, where her splendor is hidden by her lowliness, as was the majesty of Jesus when he walked on earth in his humiliation. Hendrickson says, on earth this church may appear very insignificant and open to scorn and ridicule, but from the aspect of heaven, this church is all glorious. And Dan Chambers concurs with that this vision of sun, moon, and stars symbolize God's presence, God's illuminating presence and His glory that's evidenced in His people. She's in birth pains. She's enduring pain as she's anticipating, waiting for the birth of this male child. It was difficult for the people of the covenant people of God, the true people of God, to carry out their God-given burden to bring forth this child, to be holy people, to be people who endured difficult circumstances, oppression at times, the appeal of worldliness at times, and to remain faithful enough and endure enough to bring about the Savior that God had promised. It's reflected in Old Testament prophecy. It's reflected in the New Testament. Isaiah chapter 64. Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at your presence. Which is really anticipating in Isaiah 65, 66, the end of times. We still long for the presence of God. But the people of old, the people of the old covenant, longed for the fulfillment of those promises that they had heard for so long. Again from Isaiah chapter 26, verse 17, like a pregnant woman who writhes and cries out in her pangs when she's near to giving birth, so were we because of you, O Lord. It continues, Micah chapter 5, verse 2, you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me, one who is to be ruler of Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, foretelling, of course, of the coming of Christ in Bethlehem. Luke chapter 2, verse 25. There was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was righteous and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel. And the Holy Spirit was upon him. Consolation. When do you console someone? When they're hurting. When they've experienced loss. John chapter 16, verse 21, Jesus speaks of even to this night, to that very night in which he is going to be betrayed in the hands of his enemies. Jesus is still speaking of those birth pangs. When a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come, but when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for a joy that a human being has been born into the world. The dragon. If you miss the point that the dragon is Satan, I don't see how that is possible. I don't see how you can, because it's clearly stated in Revelation chapter 12. This is Satan. Dragon is used, the vision of the symbolization of the dragon is used because it is powerful and deadly. Linsky says the word dragon expresses the extreme, ferocious, murderous, beastly, cruel power with a connotation of horror for men. And that's what Satan is. He says this is a vision as thus seen in heaven, where in the heavenly light the dragon appears as he really is. There's no disguising Satan in heaven. From the heavenly perspective, it's very evident who he is. On earth, sometimes Satan appears to be the good guy, the guy that's going to bring fun into your life, the guy that's going to bring success into your life. From the heavenly perspective, they know exactly who he is. They know exactly what he does. He has 7 heads. There's a little bit of, I'll grant you, there's a little bit of head scratching involved with some of this interpretation. And not everything about the 7 heads and the 10 horns is all that evident. As we consider what those may be, here's what commentarists have offered. The 7 crowned heads indicates the devil's world dominion. In other words, he is completely in control of this world from an authority standpoint. Jesus himself in John chapter 12, verse 31, calls him the ruler of this world. Ephesians chapter 2, he's referred to as the prince of the power of the air. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 talks about the cosmic powers over this present darkness, the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Lansky says, we think we may safely say, when the holy number 7 appears in connection with the devil, it indicates the arrogant assumption of a relationship to men which belongs to God alone. 3 to designate God, 4 to designate the world. Over and over, 7 is used in Revelation and connected with God. When it's used of Satan, it is used to describe his stepping into the role of God, trying to displace God in the lives of men. It is not the symbol of lawful authority, lawful power, but usurped authority, Kaufman says. Dan Chambers sees the 7 heads as indicating his cunning, his complete intellect, and all his mental power that's at work in bringing about the destruction of people, destruction of men. We know that Satan is devious. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11, we wear the armor of God so that we can stand against the schemes of the devil. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11, so that we would not be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his designs. Satan's evil, but he's not stupid. He's quite successful in what he does. And again from 2 Corinthians, as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning. He has 7 crowns, 7 diadems. They're not the same as the Stephanos that the woman wears. What's the difference? Well, the diadem, diadema in Greek, differs from the Stephanos, the crown of victory. It's just a symbol of one who's in power. And certainly Satan has that. He has power, he has authority. But he doesn't have victory. He never has victory. He will never have victory. He will always lose. Lansky says, we note that Jesus received a Stephanos of thorns. Even in the crucifixion, Jesus is wearing a crown of victory. And then was mocked as King of the Jews. Here the woman has the 12 stars as her Stephanos, her symbol of victory. The victory ours remaineth, Luther says. And thus, as victor, the Una Sancta, the Church Universal, shall reign with Christ forever. The dragon has no Stephanos, not even a usurped wreath of victory, but only diadems, royal fillets of pretended kingship, symbols of arrogated dominion. He also has 10 horns. Horns are used in Revelation as symbols of power. He has complete power. 10 is symbolic. He has the full extent of power. He has destructive power. Lansky says, thus the 10 horns of the dragon equals the complete power arrogated, that is, assumed without right, by Satan in this usurped dominion over men. This dragon, the devil, would be God so that all men might bow before him. That's what he desires. Dan Chambers says of the 10 horns, the combination of the 7 heads, the 10 horns, intelligence and power shows that he is an unrivaled, formidable enemy. And then there's this brief description of something that occurs His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. This recalls, in Linsky's words, the monstrous grasshoppers that rose, the locusts that arose out of the smoke of the abyss. In their tails is their power. The 1/3 recalls the same fraction in which the first 4 visions of the trumpets. The purpose is evident. We are to understand that confronted by the monster who had done this to 1/3 of the stars, the pregnant woman and her child about to be born are certainly in mortal danger. He doesn't focus a lot of time in his interpretation of just what's talked about in that. Did Satan take down 1/3 of the angels? Is that what this means? Possibly. But no question, in this heavenly vision, we're seeing the lethality of the dragon and the danger that awaits this child who is about to be born to this most vulnerable of women. Hendrickson says, when Satan fell, he dragged along with him in his ruin 1/3 of the stars of heaven, that is a vast number of evil spirits. He references 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, Jude, verse 6. As for the tail, this is Linsky, not only is the dragon always conceived as having a tremendous tail, here one that is so mighty as to sweep so many stars from the sky, but the hellish tail is the instrument of lying power. And he refers back to Isaiah, the prophet that teaches lies, he is the tail. Thus we have a description of Satan's power manifested in the most terrible thing he has done, whatever that may be. He's known by that. That's his calling card in heaven. And Dan Chambers says that simply indicates his incredible strength and power. No question about who this is, though, and what he's bringing in his presence as he's waiting to devour this child. The first great enemy of Christ's church, the cause of all hostility against her, is Satan. And then we have the child. And it should be no surprise to any of you that the child that we've been anticipating from creation, from the days of Eve, and the first sin that's introduced into the world, until the moment that Christ came in the flesh, and really to the moment that Christ was crucified on the cross. This child that's referred to in this vision is, of course, Christ. He is of the seed of woman, born of woman. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of woman, born under the law. And He is the fulfillment of Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, which we made reference to a few moments ago. He is the one who is going to rule with a rod of iron. We read this in our passage or our class last Wednesday. I won't go back over that, but that language is found in that same Psalm, Psalm 2, verse 9. And both this seed of woman, this child, and the one who rules with an iron rod, those are both messianic descriptions. Hendrickson spends a lot of time in his commentary goes into at length talking about the ways that Satan has attempted to devour the child, attempted to thwart the purposes of God so that he could not fulfill his promise from Genesis chapter 3. He could not bring about what he had purposed before the foundation of the world. And the Old Testament is filled with stories, with examples in which there's a certain number of close calls, if you will, where God's purposes were very close to being thwarted. And yet it is the power of God, it is God's providence that in each of these cases causes there to be a resolution so that His plan can be carried out. We won't take time to go through each of those I'm already battling time. My second worst enemy, second greatest enemy. In verse 5, she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Her child was caught up to God and to his throne. It's, there's this anticipation. He's just waiting to pounce, waiting to have at this child that's come into the world. And boom. It's just like, it's just almost like in an instant. He's not here, he's on the throne. Such a brief period of time that Jesus ministered on the earth. That Jesus was present in the world. And we know where He is. We know where this Son is, this child is. He is reigning over all. He has been given all authority. And this expectation of the dragon, it didn't just end at the birth of Jesus. Satan was attempting to destroy Jesus throughout His ministry, all the way up to the cross. Lindsay says, we must remember that this is a vision, and thus we do not think merely of Bethlehem, but in this birth we must include the entire presence of Christ on earth as the Messiah. So also we have no difficulty with the intent of Satan regarding the child, for Satan certainly manifested it all along, beginning with the murderous scheme of Herod in the temptations of Christ and extending to His crucifixion. In other words, Satan sought to destroy Christ not just before He was born or right after His birth, but throughout His ministry. Through His own apostles, who through misunderstanding or resentment, perhaps, tried to persuade Him not to go to the cross. Matthew chapter 16. Peter's, Lord, this will never happen to you. You're not going to be delivered in the hands of the chief priests and scribes and be crucified. That's not going to happen to you. What's Jesus' response to that? Get behind me, Satan. He recognizes the message of Satan coming through one of His closest friends, one of the most bold and outspoken followers. He recognizes this deceitful scheme of Satan. Over and over and again, His opponents sought to have Him put to death. In John chapter 10, verse 31 through 33, Jesus said, I've done many works from the Father. For which of them are you going to stone me? Oh, it's not for good works. It's for blasphemy. We're going to stone you. People of Nazareth sought to throw Him off a cliff. Over and over again in His ministry, people were hostile to Him, carrying out the work of the dragon. Even at the cross, even at Gethsemane, Jesus wrestled with the pain that was before Him, the humiliation that was before Him, the shame that was before Him, and begged God, if it be possible, to let this cup of God's wrath pass from Him. Nevertheless, her child was caught up to God and to His throne. This is the glorification, ascension, and enthronement of the incarnate Son. I didn't quite finish chapter 12, if you've noticed. I almost got finished with the first section, and we'll pick it up there next time. Thank you all.
Good evening. Our opening song this evening will be number 71. Number 71. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of His Spirit, lost in His blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, all is at rest. I am my Savior, am happy and blessed, watching and waiting, looking above, filled with His goodness, lost in His love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. The invitation song tonight will be number 714. 714.
There's a distinct difference between requests and commands. A request is when you politely ask for something, and a command is a directive to complete a given task. There are biblical precedents for both requests and commands. A clear example of a request is seen in prayer, such as in Philippians 4, verse 6, where it states, "Let our requests be made known to God through prayer." And there are a multitude of commands in both the New and the Old Testament. The Bible records 613 laws under the Mosaical law, and Jesus gave several commands to his creation, through miracles, such as changing water to wine in John chapter 2, verses 1 and 11, and the raising of Lazarus from the dead, later in John in chapter 11. Today, we're going to review a series of commands we find mainly in Joshua chapter 1. I'm going to be reading Joshua 1, verses 6 through 9, if you want to turn there. "Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." In verses 6 through 9, God tells Joshua 3 separate times to be strong and courageous. In verse 6, God tells Joshua to be courageous because, well, he has a good reason for it. And this reason is evident that Joshua will be the individual to lead Israel to Canaan land. And this is brought to fruition later in the book of Joshua as Joshua leads Israel through the battles of Jericho and Ai and several others, and they end up taking the land. In verse 7, the command to be strong and courageous comes before advice for Joshua. And this advice chiefly concerns the law and the commandments of Moses. There's a call to action in verses 7 and 8. We're going to briefly go over 3 commands found here. In verse 7, the command to obey is found. What is obedience? If you would turn with me to Romans chapter 1, verse 5, which reads, "Through him we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all nations for his name." And here we learn that obedience comes from faith in the Lord and not ourselves. Similar to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, which is a verse as a young man I know quite well, been told several times to obey your children in the Lord, for this is right. The Lord is our spiritual father, and our parents are physical fathers. There is a correlation here. It is imperative that we trust him and have faith, because that is the base of obedience. In verse 8, the command to keep is found. And this is similar to obedience, but it's a continual action. In verse 9, God provides encouragement through his command. He tells Joshua that he will be with him. Just like Joshua was with the Israelites in countless battles and in countless wars that the Israelites fought against the many people of the land, God is with us today. We don't have Canaan to conquer, but we have a spiritual battlefield that we go to every day, and we fight to save souls. I'm going to go back to Joshua chapter 1. I'm going to read verses 16 and 18, which is the response, 16 through 18 rather, which is the response of the people. So they answered Joshua, saying, "All that you command us, we will do, and wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so we will heed you. Only the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your command and does not heed your words, and all that you command him, shall be put to death. Only be strong and of good courage." We see a direct representation of what God just told Joshua here. They say, we will follow your commands as you followed Moses' commands, and the Lord is with us. Joshua had God to help him before anything else, but God gave him the resources of the children of Israel to help him and to fall back upon. As Joshua leads the Israelites, Christ led the church, and he continues to lead the church. We may give lessons and sing songs of praise twice a week, but it's very important that Christ is the head and that we are the body of the church, Colossians 1:18. We are told in 1 Corinthians 16:13 to be courageous in the same fashion that Joshua was told to be courageous in the Old Testament. When we are handed difficulties, do we follow this example of Joshua and the command of God to show courage? We may not have the land of Canaan to conquer, but we have resources. A great example of resources that God gives us in the New Testament is found in Ephesians 6. Later in the chapter, in verses 12 and following, we see the armor of God. There are resources here such as truth, righteousness, peace, faith, salvation, and the Bible. And it is imperative that we use these and not let them go to waste. So maybe, as a Christian, you haven't been using these resources. Maybe you haven't shown godly or spiritual courage that we are commanded to. Or maybe you don't have the armor of God. You don't have the access to it. But today, you can gain access to it through baptism. I encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity as we stand and as we sing.
Before Blake leads us in our closing prayer, there's one special prayer request that has been made by the Flores family tonight. Guille Flores' mother, Bernardo Rios, lives in Mexico, and she's had some health issues for quite some time, but very recently she has had a heart attack, and the prognosis is not very good at all right now. And the family has requested that we remember her in prayer and remember this family in prayer. So please, in your personal prayers and as we pray tonight, remember the Flores family, but remember Miss Rios as well.
Pray with me, please. Dear God, we're thankful for everything that you bless us with. We're thankful for the church family here at Meridianville and being able to come and study your word. We ask that you bless us as we do so and help us to apply the lessons that we learn to do your will every day and help us to be the Christians you'd have us be and spread the gospel to others. We lift up the Flores family at this time. We ask that you bless their grandmother, help her to heal, comfort her in her ailments, and comfort them as they're away from them. We ask that you help us to be encouragers to them. We ask that you bless us as we depart tonight and help us to always do your will. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to our services tonight. If you're visiting with us, please know you're our honored guest, and we hope that you come back and visit with us at the next opportunity that you have. Got several announcements tonight. The Old Goats will be meeting tomorrow morning at 8:30 in the Fellowship Hall. There will not be a hospital ministry work day for the month of May. On Monday, May 9th, we will host the area preacher's lunch. Our speaker will be Mark Posey of Winfield, Alabama. Mark has been a missionary to the Ukraine and was trapped there when the invasion began. He will be here to tell his story and give us a unique perspective on the condition of the church there now. Anyone who has interest in hearing Mark is invited to join us. We'll have a period of meet and greet at 10, and the meeting will begin at 10:30. The Young at Heart will be going to lunch at the Yellow Deli in Pulaski on Tuesday, May 10th. Please meet at the building at 10 a.m. for a short meeting, and all seniors are invited. Bridal tea for Madeline Evans, bride-elect of Andrew Mathis, will be Sunday, May 15th from 2 to 4 in the Fellowship Hall. Please see the bulletin for her registries. Youth announcements. There will be no youth devos or activities this Sunday due to Mother's Day. That's a reminder for everyone. There is a time change on the drive-in movie at the Krabs home. The movie will be Friday, May 13th. We're starting at 6 and ending around 10. The van will be leaving at 5:45. Twigs will be on Sunday, May 15th at 3. They will be prepping a few things for Girls' Day. On Sunday, May 15th, we will have a parent and teen devo after PM service in the Fellowship Hall to help us prepare for the summer. All parents and teens are highly encouraged to come. Guys bring drinks, girls bring desserts. Rainbow Omega will be June 5th through 9th. Please sign up outside Matthew's office by Wednesday, May 18th. VBS is June 12th through the 15th. If you're willing to help, please sign up outside Matthew's office. Also, there are VBS invites on the welcome tables if you'd like to take some to hand out to family, friends, or anyone else you'd like to invite. As we just mentioned, we got several prayer requests. Bernardo Rios, mother of Guille Flores, is on oxygen in the hospital in Mexico. She's having trouble breathing and has also had a mild heart attack on Monday. Please keep her and the Flores family in your prayers. Pat Massengale, Julie Rodman's mother, is in Huntsville Hospital due to complications from COVID. Please keep her, Julie, who also has COVID, in your prayers. Last announcement, as most of you guys have noticed, on Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings, we've started having more and more attendance in the auditorium. We've put out some chairs in the back of the auditorium. Like to reserve those for visitors and those that are new coming in that may not have a seat that they typically sit in. So on Sunday morning when you come in, please be mindful of that. And that's it. Everyone have a good night. You're dismissed.